You girls lack manners, and I will teach you some manners today.
Racist white woman slaps black triplets in first class, and moments later their CO dad arrives in a way that proves sometimes the children racists assault have a father powerful enough to destroy lives with consequences that reach from airport terminals to federal courtrooms to the total social isolation that comes when your hatred is exposed for the world to see. I don't sit with animals. You black monkeys need to move to the back where you belong. A white woman's voice cut through the first-class cabin of American Airlines Flight 1829 bound for Atlanta with venom so pure it felt like physical violence, her 72-year-old face twisted with disgust as she stood in the aisle glaring down at three 12-year-old black girls sitting quietly in seats 3A, 3B, and 3C. Triplets named Amara, Ayanna, and Aliyah who'd been laughing and talking about their new baby cousins just seconds before the stranger decided their joy was an offense that needed correcting. First class is for civilized people, not for your kind. This is a premium cabin and you children don't belong here. Now get your things and move to the back of the plane before I have you forcibly removed. And she said it with the casual authority of someone who'd spent 7 decades believing that white skin gave her the right to command black bodies. That her comfort mattered more than their paid tickets or their basic human dignity or the fact that they were children who'd done absolutely nothing except exist in a space she'd decided was too good for them. The words hit the triplets like ice water, each syllable landing with the weight of hatred they'd experienced before in different contexts, but never quite like this. Never from an elderly white woman on an airplane who looked like somebody's grandmother but spoke like a relic from the Jim Crow era when black people really were forced to the back. And Amara felt her stomach clench with the familiar feeling of being judged guilty of nothing except melanin, felt tears starting to burn behind her eyes while Ayanna grabbed her sister's hands under the armrest and Aliyah's face showed the particular devastation that comes when adults who are supposed to model decency instead model cruelty. "Ma'am, we paid for these seats," Amara said, her voice shaking but trying to maintain the politeness her parents had trained into them as armor against a world that saw black children as threatening. "Our father bought these tickets for us and we have every right to be here." But the white woman whose name tag on her purse read Margaret Whitmore sneered and said, "I don't care who bought what. You don't belong in first class. This is for people of quality and you children are clearly not that." This wasn't a story from their grandparents' generation about colored sections and separate water fountains. This wasn't historical footage from the civil rights era that they studied in school and thought was safely in the past. This was happening right now in 2025 aboard a modern aircraft with leather seats and touchscreen entertainment where discrimination was supposed to be extinct but clearly thrived whenever someone decided that black children didn't deserve the same respect and access as white passengers regardless of what their tickets said or how politely they behaved. And if you think racism died somewhere between Rosa Parks and today, if you believe we've evolved past the days when black people could be told to move to the back based solely on skin color, then you need to understand something fundamental about how hatred adapts. It doesn't disappear, it just learns to speak in coded language about quality and belonging while meaning exactly what it always meant. That some people will use whatever power they have to inflict humiliation on those they've decided are beneath them. Maybe worse now because it happens while everyone pretends we're post-racial, while people film on phones but don't intervene because surely this can't be what it looks like. Surely an elderly white woman wouldn't be openly racist to children. The triplets had experienced microaggressions before, had dealt with teachers who assumed they were less capable despite being honor students, store security who followed them through aisles, adults who touched their hair without permission or made comments about how articulate they were as if intelligence in black children was surprising. But this felt different. Felt more dangerous because they were about to be trapped at 30,000 feet with this woman who clearly hated them, and they had no adults with them to protect them, no parents to intervene, just each other and the sinking realization that sometimes doing everything right still wasn't protection against cruelty. They were flying to Atlanta to meet their new baby cousins. Their Aunt Keisha had given birth to twins 3 days ago and the naming ceremony was tomorrow, and their father had sent them ahead on this flight because he had meetings he couldn't miss but would join them tonight, had paid for first-class seats because he wanted his daughters comfortable, had given them spending money and instructions to call if they needed anything, never imagining they'd need rescue from a passenger who'd decided their black skin disqualified them from dignity. Other first-class passengers watched this confrontation with varying degrees of discomfort. some pretending not to notice while others filmed on their phones with that detached curiosity that treats other people's trauma as content rather than crisis requiring intervention, and their silence felt like its own violence. Like permission for Margaret to continue her assault unchecked because if nobody stopped her then maybe what she was doing was acceptable, maybe these black children really were the problem rather than the racist attacking them. A businessman in his 40s sitting across the aisle met Amara's eyes for just a moment, long enough for her to see recognition there, long enough for him to look away in shame, but not long enough for him to actually speak up, to use his voice or his adult authority to say this is wrong, leave these children alone. If you believe children should never be called animals because of their skin color, keep watching because what happens when these girls' father finds out will restore your faith that sometimes racism meets consequences, and if you've ever witnessed discrimination and stayed silent, drop a comment below about where you're watching from because you need to see what your silence costs. And this story doesn't end with just an apology. This story ends with a woman losing everything including her freedom. So hit that like button if you stand against racism and subscribe to this channel because what's about to happen proves that assaulting black children whose father is a CEO comes with a price racists never expect to pay. Margaret reached down and grabbed Ayanna's arm with enough force to leave marks, her fingers digging into 12-year-old flesh, and she hissed, "Move now or I'll move you myself, you disrespectful little." But before she could finish, Ayanna pulled away and said with tears streaming down her face, "Don't touch me, you have no right to put your hands on us." But to understand how 3 honor students ended up being assaulted by a stranger in first class, how 3 sisters traveling to celebrate new life ended up facing hatred that would traumatize them permanently, we need to go back 8 hours to a beautiful home in Chicago where this morning started not with confrontation but with excitement and a father's love expressed through ensuring his daughters traveled in comfort and style. Amara Joy Thompson, Ayanna Grace Thompson, and Aliyah Faith Thompson were 12-year-old triplets, 7th graders at Lincoln Park Academy where they maintained straight A averages and participated in debate team, choir, and student government despite the pressure of being among the few black students in predominantly white spaces that required them to be excellent just to be considered equal. Their father, David Thompson, was CEO of Thompson Financial Group, an investment firm he'd built over 20 years into a company managing $3 billion in assets for clients ranging from pension funds to high-net-worth individuals. A self-made black man who'd grown up in Southside Chicago and used his intelligence and work ethic to create generational wealth while never forgetting where he came from or the barriers he'd overcome. Their mother, Angela, was a pediatric surgeon at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and together the Thompsons had created a life of privilege for their daughters while constantly reminding them that their advantages came with responsibilities to uplift their community and fight injustice wherever they encountered it. The triplets were inseparable in the way that only multiples can be, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in the shorthand of people who'd shared a womb and never known life apart. Amara the natural leader and protector, Ayanna the peacemaker who could defuse conflicts with wisdom beyond her years, and Aliyah the creative spirit who saw beauty and possibility where others saw obstacles. They'd been raised with every advantage wealth could provide but also with constant awareness that their black skin would make the world see them differently, that excellence was expected not optional, that they'd have to work twice as hard for half the recognition, lessons their parents had taught them through both words and example of navigating corporate America while black. They were polite, responsible, mature beyond their years, the kind of children who said please and thank you automatically, who held doors for strangers, who'd been taught that respectability might not protect them from racism but at least ensured they could never be blamed for provoking it. That morning they'd woken at 5 am too excited to sleep properly, packed their small suitcases with clothes for the naming ceremony and gifts for their new baby cousins. Twin babies their Aunt Keisha and Uncle Marcus had named Caleb and Chloe, who they'd only seen in photos but already loved fiercely. Their mother Angela had flown to Atlanta 3 days earlier to help Keisha with the twins, and the triplets were supposed to join her this weekend for the naming ceremony, a big family celebration that would bring together relatives from across the country to welcome the newest Thompsons into the world. Their father David had driven them to O'Hare International Airport himself that morning, using the drive to give them the talk he'd given countless times about how to behave in airports and on planes, stay polite even if people are rude, don't give anyone a reason to see you as threatening, remember that the world judges you differently because you're black, protect each other, Call me immediately if anything feels wrong. Check-in at the American Airlines counter had been smooth, the agent processing their first-class tickets with professional efficiency and commenting that they must be excited about their trip, and security was normal, TSA waving them through without incident because they knew how to navigate those checkpoints, laptops out, shoes off, respectful responses to every question. They'd waited at gate H7 for 40 minutes doing homework and texting friends, and when boarding was called they'd walked onto flight 1829 feeling happy about seeing their mother and meeting their baby cousins, about having a weekend of family and celebration. The plane was a newer 737 with comfortable leather first-class seats, and they'd settled into row 3 with practiced efficiency, Amara at the window, Ayanna in the middle, Aliyah on the aisle, arranging themselves the way they always did when traveling together. The initial flight crew had been lovely, a young black male flight attendant named Marcus who'd helped them stow their bags and brought them apple juice without being asked, commenting that it was nice to see young people traveling and asking about their trip, genuine warmth that made them feel welcomed. A Latina flight attendant with kind eyes had checked their seatbelts and pointed out the emergency exits with the same care she'd shown every passenger, treating them like the children they were rather than threats to be managed. And for those first 20 minutes of boarding everything had felt normal, felt safe, felt like a trip that would be remembered for joy instead of trauma. Then Margaret Whitmore boarded, walking slowly down the aisle with the entitled air of someone who'd never been told no in 7 decades, and when she reached row 4 directly behind the triplets her face transformed from neutral to hostile as she processed 3 young black girls in the first-class seats she'd apparently expected to be occupied only by people who looked like her. She'd stood there staring at them with undisguised contempt, her mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval, and Amara had felt that familiar prickle of awareness that meant danger, that instinct black people develop for recognizing when someone has decided you're a problem before you've done anything except exist in their sight line. The girls had been talking and laughing about their baby cousins, imagining what Caleb and Chloe would look like in person, debating who would get to hold them first, their voices happy and age-appropriate, not loud or disruptive, just 12-year-olds being 12-year-olds. But Margaret had leaned forward and said with sharp irritation, "Could you children please be quiet? Some of us are trying to relax before this flight and your noise is disturbing," her tone carrying more hostility than the situation warranted, treating normal childhood conversation as if it was offensive behavior. "We're sorry," Ayanna had said immediately, always the peacemaker, "we didn't mean to bother you," and they'd lowered their voices to whispers, trying to accommodate the stranger's displeasure even though other passengers throughout first class were talking at equal or greater volume without complaint. But Margaret's face hadn't softened, her eyes had stayed cold and judgmental. Margaret's face hadn't softened after the girls apologized and lowered their voices. Her eyes had stayed cold and judgmental, scanning them with the kind of assessment that felt invasive and dehumanizing. And after a few minutes of tense silence during which the triplets tried to focus on their phones and not think about the hostile presence directly behind them, Margaret leaned forward again and said in a voice loud enough to carry through first class, "Kids, I don't think I can sit with you. People, can you please move to the back? This is first class and it's meant for a certain type of passenger and you clearly don't belong here. Now be good children and relocate yourselves before we have a problem." The directness of the demand, the casual way she said "you people" with all the racist weight that phrase carried, the assumption that 3 black children would simply obey when a white woman told them to move to the back of a plane, left the triplets momentarily speechless with shock because this couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening in 2025 on a commercial aircraft where segregation was illegal and discrimination was supposedly unthinkable. "We paid for these seats," Amara said, her voice shaking but determined, trying to hold onto the dignity her parents had taught her was her birthright regardless of what racists thought. "Our father bought these tickets for us and we have every right to be here. Ma'am, you need to leave us alone." But Margaret's face flushed red with the particular rage that white people sometimes display when black people refuse to comply with their demands, when they assert their rights instead of accepting subordinate positions, and she said with rising volume, "Don't you dare talk back to me, you disrespectful child. I'm a paying passenger and I have a right to a comfortable flight without having to sit near." She paused as if searching for language that wouldn't be overtly illegal but landed on it. "Anyway, near people who don't meet the standards of first class. Now move before I call someone to make you move." The threat hung in the air, making other passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats, some turning to watch this confrontation unfold, and Ayanna felt tears starting to burn in her eyes because they were being treated like criminals, like their presence was an offense, like their black skin disqualified them from dignity no matter how polite they were or how legitimate their tickets were. "We're not moving," Aliyah said, her voice stronger than her sister's because anger was overriding her fear. "We didn't do anything wrong and you can't make us leave our seats just because you're racist," and the word racist spoken aloud seemed to enrage Margaret further, seemed to offend her more than her own discriminatory behavior offended her, and she stood up from her seat leaning over the triplets with physical intimidation that made all three girls shrink back instinctively. "How dare you call me racist?" Margaret hissed, her face inches from Amara's. "I'm simply asking for what I paid for, which is a first-class experience without having to tolerate children who clearly weren't raised with proper manners. Your parents should be ashamed sending you out in public when you don't know how to behave. Now I'm telling you one last time to move to the back where you belong before I make you move." The phrase "where you belong" carried centuries of racist history, echoed the language of segregation that had supposedly ended before these girls were born, and hearing it directed at them made the reality of ongoing racism undeniable, made clear that all their achievements and their parents' success and their careful politeness meant nothing to someone who decided their skin color was the only relevant fact. A flight attendant approached, a white woman in her 30s whose name tag read Jessica, and she said with professional neutrality, "Is everything all right here?" I heard raised voices and wanted to make sure everyone's comfortable, her tone suggesting she was trying to de-escalate without taking sides, trying to solve a problem without acknowledging that the problem was racism rather than a simple passenger dispute. "This woman is harassing us," Amara said, pointing at Margaret. "She told us we don't belong in first class and demanded we move to the back of the plane because we're black. We showed her our tickets and explained we paid for these seats, but she won't leave us alone." And Jessica's face showed discomfort at having racism named explicitly, at being forced to acknowledge what was happening rather than treating it as a personality conflict that could be smoothed over with platitudes. "I'm not harassing anyone," Margaret said before Jessica could respond. "I'm simply trying to enjoy my flight and these children are being disruptive and disrespectful. I asked them politely to quiet down and they became aggressive and started calling me names. I'm the victim here and I demand you do something about their behavior." The inversion of reality was so blatant, so easily disproven by the multiple passengers who'd witnessed the entire exchange, but Margaret said it with such conviction that Jessica seemed uncertain, seemed to be calculating whether it was safer to believe the elderly white woman or the young black girls, and her hesitation felt like betrayal, felt like another small violence added to the larger assault. "Ma'am," Jessica said to Margaret, trying to thread an impossible needle, "I'm sure we can resolve this. Perhaps if everyone just takes a moment to calm down and—" But Margaret cut her off with imperious dismissal. "I don't need to calm down. I need you to remove these children from first class. They're making me uncomfortable and I paid good money for this seat and I shouldn't have to tolerate this. Now do your job or get me someone who will." Jessica looked between Margaret and the triplets, her face showing she knew this was wrong but wasn't sure how to handle it, and she said weakly, "Let me get my supervisor. Perhaps they can help sort this out." And she walked away, leaving the girls sitting there with Margaret looming over them, radiating hatred that felt dangerous, felt like it could escalate beyond words into something worse. Another flight attendant appeared, an older black woman whose name tag read Patricia, and her face when she saw the situation showed immediate understanding of what was happening, recognition born from probably experiencing similar racism herself, and she said with firm authority, "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat and stop bothering these passengers. They have legitimate tickets and they're not doing anything wrong. You're the one causing a disturbance and if you continue I'll have to ask the captain to remove you from this flight." Patricia's intervention seemed to enrage Margaret even further, her face going from red to almost purple with the kind of fury that comes from having authority challenged by someone she clearly viewed as doubly subordinate, both an employee and a black woman, and she turned her venom toward Patricia with escalating hostility saying, "Excuse me, but I don't take orders from someone like you. I want to speak to a real supervisor. Someone in charge, not—" She waved her hand dismissively at Patricia. "Not whatever you are. Now get me someone who can actually help instead of taking the side of these troublemakers." The racism wasn't even coded anymore, wasn't hiding behind language about standards or comfort. It was naked and obvious in the way Margaret refused to acknowledge Patricia's authority, in the way she demanded a real supervisor with the clear implication that a black woman couldn't possibly be qualified for that role. "I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft," Patricia said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "which means I am in charge of this cabin, and I'm telling you that you need to return to your seat immediately and stop harassing these children or you will be removed from this flight. This is your final warning." But Margaret just laughed, a sound without humor that carried contempt and certainty that consequences wouldn't reach her, that her whiteness and her age gave her immunity from accountability, and she said with sneering confidence, "You're not removing anyone. I'm a platinum member with this airline. I've been flying first class for 40 years, and I know my rights. These children are the ones who should be removed. They're clearly flying on charity or stolen miles or something because there's no way they could afford these seats legitimately. Their kind doesn't belong in first class, and everyone here knows it even if you're all too politically correct to say it." The phrase "their kind" hung in the air like poison gas, making passengers throughout first class shift uncomfortably, making undeniable what many had probably suspected but hoped wasn't really happening, and the triplets felt the weight of every eye on them, felt the shame of being reduced to their skin color in front of strangers, felt the humiliation of having their father's success and their family's wealth questioned because racist stereotypes said black people couldn't have money honestly. Tears were streaming down Ayanna's face now. She'd given up trying to hold them back, and Aliyah had wrapped her arms around her sister while Amara tried to maintain composure even as her hands shook with the adrenaline of fear and rage mixed together, because they were 12 years old and trapped in this situation with an adult who hated them and authority figures who seemed uncertain how to protect them. Jessica, the first flight attendant, had returned with a white man in a pilot's uniform, presumably someone with enough authority to end this situation, and he looked between Margaret and the triplets trying to assess what was happening, his face showing he wished he was anywhere else dealing with any problem except this racially charged confrontation that had no good solutions, only varying degrees of bad outcomes depending on whose comfort he prioritized. "Ma'am, I'm First Officer Davis," he said to Margaret, his tone conciliatory in ways that made the triplets' hearts sink because they recognized that tone, had heard it before in situations where white authority figures were more interested in appeasing white complainants than protecting black victims. "Can you tell me what the problem is here so we can resolve it and get this flight departed on time?" "The problem," Margaret said, her voice taking on the reasonable tone of someone who believes they're completely justified, "is that I paid for a first-class seat expecting a certain level of service and comfort, and instead I'm seated next to children who are being loud and disrespectful. I politely asked them to quiet down and they became hostile, called me racist, refused to show basic courtesy, and when I asked this," she gestured at Patricia with disdain, person to help she threatened to remove me, the paying customer, instead of addressing the real problem, which is these children who clearly don't belong in first class. Every sentence was a lie or a distortion, transforming her racism into reasonable complaint, making herself the victim and the triplets the aggressors. And the ease with which she lied, the confidence that she'd be believed, came from 7 decades of living in a world that had always taken her word over black people's truth. "That's not what happened," Amara said, her voice breaking. "She told us we don't belong here because we're black. She said we need to move to the back of the plane. She called us animals and said first class is only for certain types of people. We have our tickets right here. We paid for these seats. We weren't being loud or disrespectful, we were just sitting here and she started harassing us." Patricia added her witness statement saying, "I observed this entire interaction and the young lady is telling the truth. This passenger made explicitly racist remarks and demands. She's the one creating the disturbance, not these children," and several other passengers nodded or murmured agreement. But First Officer Davis's face showed he was doing the calculation that authorities always do in these situations, weighing whose complaint would create more problems for the airline, whose removal would generate more paperwork and potential lawsuits. "Let's all just take a breath," Davis said, using the language of false equivalency that treats racism and anti-racism as equally problematic positions that need to be balanced. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding that got heated. Perhaps we can reseat someone so everyone's comfortable and we can depart," his suggestion making clear he was prioritizing departure time over justice. Prioritizing avoiding confrontation over protecting children from racist assault. "We're not moving," Aliyah said with more courage than she felt. "We didn't do anything wrong and we're not going to be punished because she's racist. If anyone should be reseated, it's her." and Margaret's face transformed with rage at being contradicted by a child, at being told she should be the one to compromise. "You insolent little," Margaret started, lunging forward with her hand raised, and Patricia moved to block her but wasn't fast enough to prevent Margaret's palm from connecting with Amara's cheek. If you're watching this and you've ever stayed silent when you saw a child being abused, subscribe to this channel right now and promise yourself you'll be braver next time, because what happens next when this woman assaults 3 12-year-olds will show you what consequences look like, but those consequences come too late to prevent trauma, and your voice could be the difference between a child being protected or being hurt. So hit that subscribe button if you believe we all have responsibility to protect vulnerable people from hatred. The sound of the slap echoed through first class like a gunshot. The sound of the slap echoed through first class like a gunshot. The crack of Margaret's palm against Amara's 12-year-old cheek so loud that passengers throughout the cabin gasped or cried out in shock, and Amara's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, her face immediately showing a red handprint that would darken into a bruise, her eyes wide with disbelief because adults weren't supposed to hit children. Strangers definitely weren't supposed to hit children, and the violation of that basic rule of civilization left her momentarily frozen in trauma response while pain radiated through her face and tears flooded her eyes. "That's what you get for being disrespectful," Margaret said, her voice filled with righteous satisfaction like she'd done something necessary and good rather than committed felony assault on a minor. "Maybe now you'll learn to obey when your elders tell you to do something. Maybe your parents should have taught you that lesson, but apparently I have to." Ayanna and Aliyah both screamed, their voices high and terrified, and they reached for their sister, trying to comfort her while also trying to shield themselves because if this woman would hit Amara, what would stop her from hitting them too? And their fear was justified because Margaret was already moving again, her hand raised to strike Ayanna, who'd leaned forward to check if Amara was okay. "You're assaulting me," Margaret shrieked as Ayanna instinctively raised her arms to protect her face. "This child is attacking me. I'm defending myself," and she slapped Ayanna hard enough that the girl's glasses flew off her face and clattered to the floor, hard enough that Ayanna cried out in pain and shock. And then Margaret turned to Aliyah, who was crying hysterically, and slapped her too. The third assault happening so fast that the adults who should have intervened were still processing the first blow. Still frozen in that moment of disbelief that makes people slow to act when violence erupts in spaces where violence isn't supposed to exist. Patricia finally broke through her shock and physically inserted herself between Margaret and the triplets, her body a shield while she shouted at Margaret, "Do not touch these children again. You just committed assault and you're going to be arrested. Sit down right now before this gets worse." But Margaret seemed energized by the violence she'd inflicted, seemed to feel vindicated and powerful, and she said with contempt dripping from every word, "Those children attacked me first. Everyone saw it. I was defending myself from assault by these little thugs who don't know how to behave in civilized society." The lie was so blatant that multiple passengers actually shouted denials, voices saying that's not what happened, she hit them, they didn't touch her, we all saw it. The collective witness finally breaking through the bystander effect that had kept most people silent up until physical violence made silence impossible. The triplets huddled together in their seats, crying so hard they could barely breathe, Amara's face throbbing where she'd been struck, Ayanna fumbling on the floor for her glasses with hands that shook too badly to grasp them properly, Aliyah trying to comfort her sisters while also processing her own trauma, and they looked so small and vulnerable and hurt that several passengers stood up wanting to help, wanting to do something, but uncertain what intervention looked like now that the damage had been done. A middle-aged black woman from 3 rows back pushed past other passengers to reach the girls, kneeling in the aisle and saying in a voice thick with tears, "Babies, I'm so sorry, I should have helped sooner, I should have stopped her before she hurt you," and she gathered the triplets into a hug they desperately needed, her adult protection coming too late to prevent harm but at least present now to help them feel less alone in their suffering. First Officer Davis was on his radio calling for airport police, his face showing he understood this had escalated beyond anything he could handle internally, that assault on minors required law enforcement response regardless of what complications that created for departure schedules. And he said to Margaret with authority he should have used 20 minutes earlier, "Ma'am, you need to remain in your seat. Police are on their way and you're not leaving this aircraft until they've taken your statement. You're being detained for assault." But Margaret just laughed again, that same contemptuous sound, and said I'm the victim here, those children in there. She paused, looking at Patricia with disgust. Their defender assaulted me and I defended myself. Any reasonable person would have done the same. I'll be filing charges against them and against this airline for allowing dangerous passengers in first class. The businessman who'd made eye contact with Amara earlier and then looked away in shame now stood up and said loudly, I recorded the entire incident on my phone. This woman assaulted 3 children who were sitting quietly in their seats. She made racist demands that they move to the back. She called them animals. She struck them multiple times while they tried to defend themselves. I have clear video evidence and I'm providing it to police and to these children's parents and to anyone else who needs to see what happened here. Other passengers echoed his testimony, a young woman saying I recorded it too, a college student saying I got the whole thing. We all saw what you did. The collective documentation making Margaret's lies impossible to sustain even though she continued insisting she was the victim, that she'd been attacked, that the triplets deserved what they got for being disrespectful. Amara felt her face swelling where Margaret had struck her, felt the physical pain mixing with emotional devastation that was so much worse, the humiliation of being hit in front of strangers, the terror of being attacked by an adult while other adults watched, the grief of learning that sometimes doing everything right still wasn't protection from violence, and she whispered to her sisters through sobs that caught in her throat, we need to call Dad, we need to tell him what happened her. Child's faith that their father could fix this even though she was old enough to understand that some things couldn't be fixed only survived. Ayanna had retrieved her glasses, one lens cracked from where they'd hit the floor, and she nodded saying yes, call Dad right now, he'll know what to do. And Aliyah was already pulling out her phone with shaking hands, already navigating to their father's contact, already dreading having to tell him that his daughters had been assaulted and he hadn't been there to protect them. Airport police arrived within 5 minutes, 2 officers in uniform who surveyed the scene with grim expressions, taking in 3 crying children with visible injuries, a belligerent elderly white woman insisting she was the victim, and a cabin full of witnesses all trying to talk at once. And the lead officer whose name tag read Sergeant Martinez said with weary authority that suggested she'd seen too many variations of this scene. Everyone please stay calm, we're going to sort this out. Need statements from witnesses and I need to see identification from everyone involved. And she looked at the triplets with compassion that made them cry harder because kindness after cruelty always hits different, always breaks through defenses that anger couldn't penetrate. Margaret was still ranting about being assaulted, about pressing charges, about her rights as a passenger, but Sergeant Martinez cut her off saying, ma'am, I'm going to need you to be quiet. Multiple witnesses have stated that you struck these minors. That's a serious crime and you need to understand the gravity of your situation. Sergeant Martinez knelt down to the triplets' eye level, her face showing the particular gentleness that law enforcement sometimes manages when dealing with child victims. And she said softly, girls, I need you to tell me what happened here. Take your time, you're safe now, nobody's going to hurt you anymore. And Amara tried to speak but couldn't get words out past the sobs that kept interrupting her breathing, couldn't organize her thoughts into coherent narrative when her face was throbbing and her whole body was shaking with adrenaline crash. So Aliyah took over explaining through tears about Margaret's demands that they move to the back, about the racist comments, about asking flight attendants for help, about the escalation that led to being struck 3 times while passengers watched and filmed but mostly didn't intervene until violence made intervention unavoidable. Martinez's partner Officer Chen was taking statements from witnesses, his notebook filling with consistent testimony that all contradicted Margaret's version of events, the businessman showing his video footage that captured everything in clear detail, the audio picking up Margaret's racist language and the sound of the slaps and the girls' cries, evidence so damning that no amount of lying could overcome it. Margaret watched the video being shown to police and her face shifted from righteous indignation to something that might have been the beginning of understanding that her actions would have consequences she hadn't anticipated, that assaulting children on an aircraft while being recorded by multiple witnesses wasn't something she could talk her way out of or have dismissed through complaints to management. I want to call my father, Amara said to Sergeant Martinez, her voice small and broken in ways that made the officer's eyes fill with tears she tried to hide. We need to tell him what happened. He told us to call if anything went wrong and this went really wrong. And Martinez nodded saying, of course, sweetie, you can call your parents right now. Do you want privacy or do you want me to stay with you while you make the call? Amara said, please stay. The presence of protective authority comforting even though it came too late. and she pulled out her phone with hands that still trembled badly enough that she had trouble unlocking the screen, had to try the passcode twice before getting it right, and then she was pressing her father's contact and listening to it ring while her heart hammered with the knowledge that she was about to break his heart by telling him his daughters had been hurt and he hadn't been there to prevent it. David Thompson answered on the second ring with his usual warmth, saying, "Hey princess, you girls get to Atlanta okay? Are you with your mom yet?" His voice so normal and happy that Amara started crying harder at the contrast between his assumption that everything was fine and the reality of what had actually happened. "Daddy," she managed to choke out, "something bad happened. We're still at the airport in Chicago and a woman hit us. She hit all three of us. She called us animals and said we don't belong in first class, and when we wouldn't move to the back she slapped us, and Daddy, my face hurts so bad and I'm scared and I don't know what to do." The words tumbled out in a rush punctuated by sobs, and David's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the phone connection. Was the sound of a father's worst nightmare materializing? Was every protective instinct activating at once with nowhere to direct the energy because his children were hurt and he was miles away, unable to reach them? "Baby, where exactly are you right now?" David said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Are you safe? Are the police there? Is someone helping you? Tell me everything and don't leave anything out." Amara handed the phone to Sergeant Martinez, saying, "He wants to talk to you." And Martinez took it, saying, "Mr. Thompson, this is Sergeant Maria Martinez with Chicago Police Department Airport Unit. Your daughters are safe now, they're with me, but I need to inform you that they were assaulted by another passenger, an elderly white woman who struck all three of them. We have the suspect in custody and multiple witnesses, including video evidence. Your daughters have visible injuries and will need to get them medically evaluated. Are you able to come to O'Hare, or should I coordinate with someone else?" "I'm 20 minutes away," David said, his voice carrying the controlled fury of someone used to making decisions in crisis. "I'm leaving my office right now. Don't let that woman near my children. Don't let her leave. I want her arrested and charged with every possible crime. And Sergeant, I'm the CEO of Thompson Financial Group and I have lawyers on retainer who will ensure this case is prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. That woman made the biggest mistake of her life when she decided my daughters were acceptable targets for violence." Martinez assured him his daughters would be protected, that the suspect wasn't going anywhere, that medical personnel were being called to evaluate the girl's injuries, and she handed the phone back to Amara, who heard her father saying, "I'm coming, baby. I'm in the car right now. I'm going to be there so fast. You and your sister stay together and stay with the police officer and don't talk to anyone else. Daddy's coming to fix this, I promise." The triplets huddled together in their first-class seats that had become the scene of trauma they'd carry forward into lives forever changed by this morning, and they watched as Margaret Whitmore was handcuffed by Officer Chen, watched her face transform from defiant to shocked as metal bracelets closed around her wrists, watched her being read her rights in language that included words like assault on a minor and hate crime enhancement, legal terminology that suggested this wasn't going to be resolved with an apology or a fine, but with serious criminal consequences. "You're making a mistake," Margaret said to the officers, her voice less certain now. "I'm 72 years old. I've never been arrested in my life. Those children provoked me. You can't do this to me." And Chen said in a voice flat with professional detachment, "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right." Other passengers were giving statements to police, creating a record of witness testimony that would be used to prosecute Margaret, and several approached the triplets to apologize for not intervening sooner, to say they were sorry, to offer comfort that felt inadequate measured against the harm that had been allowed to happen. The middle-aged black woman who'd hugged them earlier was crying openly, saying, "I'll never forgive myself for not protecting you sooner. I saw what was happening and I was scared to get involved, and that cowardice let you get hurt." And Ayanna said through her own tears, "It's not your fault. You helped us after that matters," her grace toward an adult who'd failed her, making that adult cry harder. Patricia, the flight attendant, sat with the girls while they waited for their father, her arm around Aliyah, who'd latched onto her and wouldn't let go, and she said in a voice thick with emotion, "I'm so sorry this happened on my aircraft. I'm so sorry I couldn't stop her before she hurt you." Patricia, the flight attendant, sat with the girls while they waited for their father, her arm around Aliyah, who'd latched onto her and wouldn't let go, and she said in a voice thick with emotion, "I'm so sorry this happened on my aircraft. I'm so sorry I couldn't stop her before she hurt you. I tried, but I wasn't fast enough, and now you're hurt and traumatized, and nothing I say can fix that." And Aliyah just pressed closer to her, seeking the adult protection and comfort she should have received. Before violence occurred rather than after, seeking warmth against the coldness of learning that the world contained people who would hurt children and systems that wouldn't always prevent that harm quickly enough to matter. David Thompson arrived at gate H7 18 minutes after receiving his daughter's call, moving so fast through the airport that security had trouble keeping up with him, his expensive suit rumpled and his face showing the particular devastation of a father who'd sent his children into danger without knowing danger waited, who'd kissed them goodbye that morning thinking they'd be safe in first class on a reputable airline only to discover that money and respectability politics couldn't always protect black children from the hatred some white people carried like weapons waiting for targets. He saw his daughters before they saw him, saw them huddled together with visible injuries on Amara's swelling face, saw their tear-stained cheeks and traumatized expressions, saw how small they looked despite being almost as tall as their mother, and something in his chest cracked open with grief so profound it threatened to bring him to his knees right there in the terminal. "Daddy," the triplets cried in unison when they spotted him, and they ran to him with the unself-conscious need that children have when they're hurt and want their parents, and David caught all three of them in his arms, holding them so tight it probably hurt, but none of them complained, all of them needing that pressure, that proof that he was really there and they were safe now, even if safe was a relative concept after what they'd experienced. "I'm here," David whispered into their hair, his voice breaking completely. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Daddy's going to fix this, I promise. Nobody hurts my babies and gets away with it." And the girls cried harder at hearing their father's pain mixing with their own, at knowing their trauma had become his trauma, at understanding that this attack had wounded their whole family, not just the three of them. Sergeant Martinez approached David with professional sympathy and said, "Mr. Thompson, I'm very sorry about what happened to your daughters. We have the suspect in custody. She's been arrested and will be charged with 3 counts of assault on a minor, battery, and we're looking at federal charges as well since this occurred on an aircraft. The video evidence is clear and there are multiple witnesses. This is about as solid a case as we ever see." David nodded his thanks, but his attention was on his daughters, on checking Amara's face where the handprint had darkened to an ugly bruise, on examining Ayanna's cracked glasses and the red mark on her cheek, on running his hands over Aliyah, checking for injuries he couldn't see, his touch gentle but his face showing barely controlled rage at whoever had dared to hurt his children. "Where is she?" David asked, his voice deadly calm in the way that people who know how to wield power speak when they're preparing to destroy someone. "Where is the woman who did this? I want to see her." And Martinez hesitated, saying, "Mr. Thompson, I understand your anger, but I don't think confrontation is advisable right now. We have her in custody and she's being processed. Your focus should be on your daughters and getting them medical attention." But David's jaw tightened and he said, "I need to see the person who called my daughters animals, who told them they belonged in the back, who put her hands on them when they're children and she's a grown adult. I need to look her in the eye and make sure she understands exactly what consequences look like when you attack the children of someone with resources to ensure justice isn't just a word but an actual outcome." Margaret Whitmore was seated in a chair near the gate desk, surrounded by Officer Chen and 2 airport security personnel, her hands still cuffed, her face showing confusion and resentment rather than remorse. And when David approached with his daughters behind him clinging to his jacket, her eyes widened slightly at seeing a black man in an obviously expensive suit carrying himself with the authority of someone used to being the most powerful person in any room. "You did this," David said, his voice vibrating with fury he was barely containing. "You looked at my daughters and decided their black skin meant you could treat them like they were nothing. You put your hands on children, you assaulted them because you thought there would be no consequences because you've spent 72 years getting away with racism, but you made a mistake, you attacked the wrong children, because I have the resources and the connections and the determination to make sure. You spend the rest of your life regretting this moment." Margaret's face flushed and she said with diminishing confidence, "I was defending myself. Those girls were aggressive and disrespectful. They wouldn't follow instructions. I had every right to." But David cut her off with a gesture, his hands slicing through the air like he was physically severing her justifications. "You had no right," David said, each word precise and cold. "You had no right to speak to them, no right to touch them, no right to decide they didn't belong somewhere their father paid for them to be, and now you're going to learn what it costs when you let your racism override basic human decency. You're going to be charged federally, you're going to be convicted, You're going to lose your freedom for what you did. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows your name, everyone sees your face. Everyone understands exactly who Margaret Whitmore is and what she did to 3 12-year-old girls whose only crime was existing while black. I know people, Margaret said, her last attempt at wielding the privilege that had always protected her before. I have connections with this airline. I have lawyers. You can't intimidate me with threats. And David actually smiled, though there was no warmth in it, just cold satisfaction. You know people, David repeated, his tone making it clear how little her connections meant compared to his. I am people. I'm the CEO of a firm that manages $3 billion in assets. I sit on boards with the people who run this airline. I have the mayor's personal number in my phone. I employ attorneys who specialize in civil rights litigation. And I'm going to use every bit of power and money and influence I have to ensure you face maximum consequences. So please, tell me about your connections. Tell me who you think will protect you when I'm done making sure your name becomes synonymous with racist violence against children. Margaret's face went pale as she processed that she'd assaulted the children of someone who could actually follow through on threats of total destruction, that her victim's father wasn't someone she could dismiss or intimidate or outlast. And for the first time her expression showed something that might have been fear. The triplets watched their father defend them with a ferocity they'd never seen before, watched him wield his power like a weapon on their behalf, and while part of them felt vindicated and protected, another part felt sad that it took their father being a CEO for justice to happen, that if he'd been a janitor or a teacher Margaret might have faced fewer consequences. That their protection was conditional on their family's wealth and status in ways that felt wrong even as they were grateful for. David turned back to Sergeant Martinez and said, I want medical personnel to evaluate my daughters immediately. I want photographs of their injuries for evidence. I want copies of all witness statements and video footage. And I want confirmation that this woman is being held without bail until trial. She's clearly a danger to any black person she encounters, and she shouldn't be allowed to continue terrorizing people while awaiting prosecution. Paramedics arrived within minutes of David's request. 2 EMTs with a medical kit who examined the triplets with gentle efficiency while David stood close enough to touch his hand on Amara's shoulder as they assessed her facial injuries, checked for signs of concussion, photographed the darkening bruise that covered her left cheek from eye socket to jawline in the distinctive shape of an adult hand. The lead paramedic, whose name was Rodriguez, said with quiet anger that suggested she'd seen too many cases like this. This is definitely assault. The force required to leave a mark like this on a child is significant. She was hit hard enough that we need to rule out fractures. We should transport her to the hospital for x-rays and complete evaluation, and David nodded, saying, do whatever is medically necessary. Cost is not a concern. My daughter's health is the only priority. Ayanna's injuries were less visible but still documented. The red mark on her face where she'd been struck, the scrapes on her hands from where she'd fallen reaching for her glasses, the psychological trauma that showed in her dilated pupils and rapid heartbeat, signs of a stress response that wouldn't resolve quickly or easily. Aliyah had a bruise forming on her upper arm where Margaret had grabbed her, fingerprints visible in purple shadows on brown skin, evidence of violence that made David's hands clench into fists as he watched the paramedics photograph his daughter's injuries for the criminal case that would send Margaret Whitmore to prison if David had anything to say about it. And he had quite a lot to say about it given the resources he commanded and the determination he felt to ensure this woman faced maximum consequences. The airport medical evaluation took 40 minutes, during which David made phone calls that would reshape Margaret's life in ways she was only beginning to understand. His first call to his attorney Michael Chin, who specialized in civil rights litigation. His second call to the American Airlines CEO, whom he knew through business connections. His third call to a publicist who would ensure this story received national coverage with Margaret's face and name attached to her crimes so that everywhere she went for the rest of her life people would know what she'd done. Michael, I need you at O'Hare immediately, David said into his phone. My daughters were assaulted on an aircraft by a passenger who made racist demands and then struck them when they refused to comply. We have video evidence and multiple witnesses. I want federal charges filed, and I want a civil suit that bankrupts this woman and makes an example that discourages anyone else from thinking black children are acceptable targets. The call to American Airlines CEO Robert Morrison was brief and devastating. David's voice cold with controlled fury as he said, "Robert, 3 of your passengers just witnessed and filmed one of your other passengers calling my daughters animals and assaulting them in first class. This happened on your aircraft under your airline's care. And I'm going to need you to explain to me how someone with Margaret Whitmore's history of complaints was still allowed to fly, because I'm looking at a civil suit against your airline for negligent security and failure to protect minor passengers. And unless you want this to become the biggest PR nightmare your company has faced, you're going to cooperate fully with prosecution and implement policy changes that prevent this from ever happening again." Robert assured him that American would cooperate completely, that Margaret would be permanently banned from all flights, that the airline took this situation with utmost seriousness, but David knew those assurances were motivated by liability concerns rather than genuine care, were damage control rather than moral outrage. Aliyah Thompson arrived from Atlanta on an emergency flight David had arranged, her surgical scrubs still on under her jacket because she'd left the hospital the moment David called, had abandoned her patients and her duties because her daughters needed her more than any surgery needed her, and when she saw the triplets with their injuries and their tear-stained faces, she broke down completely, gathering them into her arms and sobbing apologies that made no rational sense because she hadn't done anything wrong, but mothers always feel responsible when their children are hurt regardless of logic. "My babies," Angela whispered through tears, "my precious babies, I'm so sorry, I should have been with you, I should have protected you," and the girls cried with her, all of them processing trauma together, all of them trying to make sense of how a trip to meet new family members had turned into a nightmare that would follow them for years. The criminal complaint was filed within 2 hours. Margaret Whitmore charged with 3 counts of battery on a minor, assault, hate crime enhancement because of the racist language she'd used, and federal charges of interfering with flight crew and assault on an aircraft. Charges that carried potential prison time that could see a 72-year-old woman spending her remaining years behind bars for crimes she'd committed in full view of witnesses who'd documented everything. Margaret's public defender tried to argue for bail, tried to suggest she wasn't a flight risk given her age, but the prosecutor pointed to the video evidence showing her violence against children, pointed to her complete lack of remorse, pointed to the danger she posed to any black person she encountered, and the judge denied bail saying, "I've seen the evidence, I've heard the testimony. This defendant assaulted 3 children in a racially motivated attack and showed no understanding that her actions were wrong. She will remain in custody pending trial." Margaret's face when she realized she wouldn't be going home, when she understood that consequences were real and immediate, showed the particular shock of someone who'd gone 72 years never facing serious repercussions for racism that had probably been a constant throughout her life, who'd assumed that her whiteness and her age would protect her the way it always had before. And her lawyer whispered urgent instructions that she ignored, saying loudly to the judge, "This is a mistake. Those children attacked me, I was defending myself, you can't keep me in jail, I have a life, I have commitments," and the judge just looked at her with cold disdain and said, "You should have thought about that before you put your hands on children. Bailiff, please remove the defendant." David watched Margaret being led away in handcuffs toward pretrial detention and felt satisfaction that was complicated by the knowledge that even this justice, even this accountability, didn't undo what his daughters had experienced, didn't give them back their sense of safety or their innocence about how cruel the world could be. The triplets clung to their parents in the airport terminal that had become the site of their trauma, and Amara said in a small voice, "Daddy, can we go home? I don't want to fly anymore. I don't want to go to Atlanta. I just want to be home where it's safe." And David felt his heart break again because his daughters were scared of flying now, were scared of the thing he'd thought was safe and routine, and he said, "Of course, baby. We'll drive home right now. We'll all be together and you'll be safe. I promise." The naming ceremony for baby Caleb and Chloe happened without the triplets, their absence a wound in what should have been joyful celebration. The naming ceremony for baby Caleb and Chloe happened without the triplets, their absence a wound in what should have been joyful celebration. And when Aunt Keisha held her babies and looked at the empty chairs where her nieces should have been sitting, she cried tears that mixed grief with rage because Margaret Whitmore had stolen this moment from children who'd been so excited to meet their new cousins, had stolen joy and replaced it with trauma that would echo through this family for generations. David drove his daughters home from the airport in silence broken only by occasional sobs, the 4-hour drive to their house feeling eternal while Amara held ice to her face. while Ayanna stared out the window seeing nothing, while Aliyah curled into herself trying to make her body as small as the powerlessness she'd felt when a stranger decided to hurt her for existing. The criminal trial of Margaret Whitmore became national news within 48 hours, the video footage going viral with millions of views, the images of her slapping 3 12-year-old black girls while calling them animals becoming the kind of story that dominated news cycles and dinner table conversations, that forced America to confront again the reality that racism wasn't historical artifact but present danger, that black children could be excellent students with wealthy parents and still be targets for white violence. Major news networks interviewed witnesses from the flight, showed the footage frame by frame analyzing Margaret's racist language and the girls' terror, brought on legal experts who explained the charges and the potential sentences, created a media circus that ensured Margaret's name and face would be permanently associated with racist violence against children in ways that would follow her forever even if somehow she avoided prison. Margaret's family began distancing themselves within days of her arrest, her daughter releasing a statement saying, "We are horrified by our mother's actions. We do not condone racism or violence in any form. We stand with the Thompson family and hope they can find healing." The carefully worded condemnation making clear that Margaret's own child was choosing victims over perpetrator, was cutting ties to preserve her own reputation and moral standing. Margaret's son went further, giving an interview where he said with visible emotion, "I don't know the woman who did this. The mother I knew would never have hurt children, never would have used that kind of language. Something in her has broken, or maybe I never really knew her. But either way, I can't defend the indefensible. What she did was evil and she deserves whatever punishment she receives." His rejection absolute and public in ways designed to insulate himself from her choices. Margaret's friends abandoned her with the speed that social consequences can travel in the age of viral video and instant communication. Her church asked her not to return when she made bail after 3 weeks. Her book club expelled her. Her neighbors stopped speaking to her, and some put up signs in their yards supporting the Thompson family and condemning racism. The collective shunning creating isolation that Margaret had never experienced in 72 years of living in communities that had always accepted her, had always centered her comfort, had always forgiven her prejudices as generational quirks rather than moral failures. She lost her volunteer position at the local library, lost her membership to the country club, lost invitations to social events, lost the entire network of connection that had defined her life, and she sat alone in her house reading comment sections where thousands of strangers called her monster and racist and hoped she died in prison, reading her own obituary written while she was still alive by a culture that had decided she was beyond redemption. The trial lasted 2 weeks, the prosecution presenting overwhelming evidence including the video footage played repeatedly for the jury, including testimony from all 3 triplets who sat on the witness stand and recounted their trauma while crying, their testimony so compelling that several jurors were seen wiping tears. Amara described the moment of being struck, her voice small as she said, "I didn't understand why she hated us. We didn't do anything to her. We were just sitting there and she decided we didn't belong and then she hurt us, and I keep thinking if we just moved to the back maybe she wouldn't have hit us, but my parents taught us we have a right to sit anywhere we want and we shouldn't have to accept discrimination just to stay safe." But Ayanna testified that she now has nightmares about flying, about being trapped in small spaces with people who hate her, that she can't go anywhere without scanning for threats, that the 12-year-old innocence she'd had before that flight was gone and wouldn't come back. Aliyah's testimony broke hearts throughout the courtroom when she said through tears, "I used to think if you were polite and smart and followed all the rules then people would treat you fairly. I used to think racism was something from history that we learned about in school, but now I know it's real and it can hurt you even when you do everything right, and I'm scared all the time now. Scared that the next white person I meet might decide I don't belong somewhere and hurt me, and my parents can't protect me from that even though they're successful and have money because racism doesn't care who your parents are, and that's the worst part, knowing that nothing I achieve will ever be enough to make some people see me as human." Margaret's defense was pathetic, her attorney trying to argue that she'd felt threatened by the girl's attitude, that she'd acted in self-defense, that her age and lack of criminal history should mitigate her sentence, but the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. And when the verdict was read, Margaret's face showed shock, like she genuinely believed she'd be acquitted, like even after everything she still thought the system would protect. her whiteness over black children's humanity. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in federal prison, banned her permanently from all commercial aviation, and ordered her to pay restitution to the Thompson family, the sentence harsh by standards that usually gave white defendants leniency but still inadequate measured against the harm, still just 4 years for stealing 3 children's sense of safety and replacing it with trauma that would last lifetimes. The Thompson triplets watched the sentencing via video link from their therapist's office where they'd been attending twice weekly sessions trying to process what had happened to them, trying to rebuild the trust in the world that Margaret had shattered. And when they heard 4 years, Amara said quietly, "That's not enough. She took everything from us and only loses 4 years. How is that fair?" And her therapist, Dr. Williams, who was a black woman who understood both personally and professionally what they'd experienced, said gently, "It's not fair. Justice in America rarely is, especially when black victims and white perpetrators are involved, but it's accountability." The triplets therapist, Dr. Williams, said gently, "It's not fair. Justice in America rarely is, especially when black victims and white perpetrators are involved, but it's accountability, even if accountability feels hollow when you're 12 years old dealing with nightmares and anxiety and the loss of innocence that comes from learning the world contains people who will hurt you for existing." And the girls nodded, but their faces showed they understood what adults were still processing, that Margaret Whitmore going to prison didn't give them back what she'd taken, didn't restore their ability to move through the world without fear, didn't undo the moment when an adult's hand connected with their faces while strangers watched, and mostly did nothing until violence made inaction impossible to sustain. Margaret served 3 years and 2 months of her 4-year sentence, released early for good behavior in a prison system that somehow found her whiteness and age worthy of leniency even after she'd assaulted children. And she emerged into a world that had moved on without her but hadn't forgotten what she'd done, her name still generating headlines about racist woman who attacked black triplets, her face still recognized by strangers who crossed streets to avoid her or confronted her in grocery stores asking how she could live with herself. She moved to a small town in rural Montana trying to escape the social consequences that had made her previous life unlivable, but even there the internet followed her, neighbors Googling her name and discovering her history, making clear she wasn't welcome, that her racism had marked her permanently in ways that isolated her from human connection she'd taken for granted for 7 decades before deciding black children were acceptable targets for violence. Margaret's daughter never spoke to her again, refused phone calls and returned letters unopened, chose her own children's psychological safety over her mother's desire for reconciliation, telling reporters years later that she couldn't expose her kids to someone who'd proven capable of harming children based on skin color, that forgiveness wasn't hers to give when she wasn't the one who'd been hurt. Margaret's son visited once in prison and told her to her face that she'd destroyed their family, that his children asked why grandma hurt those girls, that he had no answers that didn't involve admitting his mother was motivated by hatred, and that conversation was the last time they spoke, their relationship another casualty of Margaret's choices on that flight. The Thompson triplets struggled with the aftermath in ways that wealth and parental support could ease but not eliminate, therapy helping them process trauma but not erasing it, medication managing anxiety but not curing the hypervigilance that made them scan every space for threats, every white person for signs of hostility. Amara developed a fear of flying so severe that even years later she couldn't board a plane without panic attacks, her parents eventually accepting they'd drive or take trains anywhere the family needed to go because forcing their daughter onto aircraft felt cruel, felt like re-traumatizing her for convenience. Ayanna's grades suffered for the first time in her academic career, her concentration fractured by intrusive thoughts about the assault, her confidence in her own safety shattered in ways that made focusing on algebra or history feel impossible when her nervous system was constantly preparing for danger. Aliyah's trauma manifested as anger, a fury at the injustice that drove her into activism, speaking at schools and conferences about racism and violence against black children, using her voice in ways she hadn't been able to use it that day on the plane when an adult was hurting her and she'd been powerless to stop it. She testified before Congress at 15 about the lasting impacts of hate crimes on child victims, her testimony compelling enough that it led to enhanced sentencing guidelines and mandatory bias training for airline employees. Her pain transformed into policy changes that might protect other children even though they came too late to protect her. David and Angela Thompson filed a civil suit against American Airlines for negligent security and failure to protect minor passengers, the case settling for an undisclosed amount that rumors suggested was in the millions, money that went into trust funds for the girls' futures and donations to civil rights organizations. But Angela told reporters the money meant nothing compared to what they'd lost. We would give back every penny to have our daughter's innocence restored, to undo the knowledge. They now carry about how people will treat them. No amount of money compensates for that theft. The Thompsons also established the Thompson Foundation for Children's Safety, funding programs to train adults on intervention when they witnessed children being harmed, funding legal support for families who couldn't afford to pursue justice the way the Thompsons could, trying to create systemic change from the wreckage of their personal tragedy. If this story broke your heart, if it made you think about times you witnessed injustice and stayed silent, if you understand now that bystander silence enables violence and your intervention could save a child from harm, then subscribe to this channel and commit to being the person who speaks up next time, who protects vulnerable people even when it's uncomfortable, because children like Amara and Ayanna and Aliyah need adults who will act before violence occurs, not just sympathize after. So, hit that subscribe button if you believe protecting children matters more than your comfort. 5 years after the assault, the triplets were 17, preparing for college, carrying scars both visible and invisible from that morning when Margaret Whitmore decided their black skin disqualified them from first class. And in a documentary about their experience, Amara said with quiet intensity, "I'm not the same person I was before that flight. None of us are. Margaret Whitmore stole something from us that we can't get back. She stole our ability to assume the best about people. She stole our sense that excellence would protect us. She stole the childhood innocence that lets you believe the world is basically fair. And even though she went to prison and lost everything, that doesn't give us back what she took. Justice after trauma isn't the same as prevention, and I wish the adults on that plane had understood that before they chose silence." Margaret Whitmore died alone at 79, estranged from her family, abandoned by her community, her obituary mentioning her volunteer work but unable to escape the paragraph about her conviction for assaulting 3 black children in a racially motivated attack, her legacy forever defined by the worst thing she'd done even though she'd lived 72 years before that flight. Some people argued she'd paid enough, that 7 years of consequences including prison and social death were sufficient punishment, but the Thompson family and the millions who'd watched the video disagreed, believed that you don't get to assault children and then complain that facing consequences is unfair. That Margaret had made her choices and lived with the results the same way her victims had to live with theirs, except their trauma would outlast her mortality. The triplets graduated high school with honors, attended different universities because they needed space to develop individual identities separate from being the girls who were assaulted, and they each carried forward the lessons learned in first class that day, that racism was alive and dangerous, that black excellence wasn't protection, that justice was possible but imperfect, that trauma could be survived but not erased, and that sometimes the price of being black in America was paid in psychological wounds that never fully healed but could be transformed into fuel for fighting systems that created Margaret Whitmore's and allowed them to harm children before anyone intervened strongly enough to prevent it.